Konnichiwa everyone. Heads up, this video contains references to offensive and sensitive words in the Japanese language. Neither I nor Unseen Japan encouraged the use of these words. Rather, we present them here for historical and educational purposes. Or, in other words, このビデオには差別用語が登場しますが、これはその単語の使用を認めているからではなく、教育、社会的認識及び歴史への意識を広げるためです。どうぞ改めてご理解ください。So there is a pervasive myth surrounding the Japanese language, that Japanese somehow lacks swear words. It is true that Japanese doesn't have a codified list of socially egregious expletives a la English.
Hey! そこのファッキングカウボーイ and ファッキングガールどうなんだい女子はファッキング学校の帰り道にこのファッキング浩平さんのファッキングホットドッグを買ってかないかい Oh baby! 買うのかいファッキングカウボーイよーし特別にこのファッキングケチャップとファッキングマスタードをたっぷりかけたファッキングホットドッグ
However, Japanese, like any language, is extremely contextual. Some words can be used in a friendly context, but never used professionally or amongst polite company. In fact, it's often explained that the best way to be rude in Japanese is simply to use informal language with someone with whom you aren't on equal footing. It's true, you shouldn't tell your boss, "Osu genki ka omae?" Yet, there does in fact exist a level of words beyond mere rudeness. These are the words of Kotobagari, hunted words too taboo for publication or broadcast. These days, most words subject to Kotobagari are also those known as sabetsugo, prejudicial words, or those associated with historical injustices. Encountering one in the wild can be startling. Take, for example, the strange case of late 2000s American tween phenomenon, iCarly. I actually recently consulted with popular YouTuber Quentin Reviews for a section of a video discussing the Nickelodeon TV movie I Go to Japan. In a sea of cultural misrepresentations, the most surprising was when a Japanese character, clearly working on a dictionary-translated script, called her brother an idiot in Japanese. The word used, however, doesn't have the simple connotation of something like baka. Rather, the character shockingly calls her brother kichigai, a word applied to those with mental illness. Kichigai is highly derogatory, and in fact is banned from Japanese TV. The scriptwriters of iCarly, thumbing through a dictionary for appropriate Japanese words, would never have known the deeper context that surrounds kichigai. Deprived of the historical and cultural baggage of the banned phrase, they casually dropped it into a script. In Japan, however, the show would never have been able to air at all with a character humorously bandying about such a taboo and hurtful word. And kichigai is just one of many such words subject to editorial self-censoring, most of whom share a deep history related to the marginalized of Japanese society. Konnichiwa minna, and welcome back to Unseen Japan. As always, I'm Noah Oskow, and today we're talking about a pretty unique combination of linguistic evolution, societal perceptions of language, and social history. I hope you find this topic as interesting as I do, and if so, give us a like and subscribe for more, or leave a comment with your thoughts, or even give us some support over at Patreon, so we can keep producing content here and on our main website. Oh, and speaking of Patreon, we have a new tradition of answering a question from a Patreon patron about Japan or about Unseen Japan itself at the end of every video. Check that out during the credits. Anyway, back to the story of Kotobagari. Now, most languages contain some concept of profanity. Indeed, there tends to be some sort of historical pathway from words considered profane, that is, insulting to that which is sacred, and modern concepts of offensive words. Broad similarities do exist across cultures, as well as cultural peculiarities. Japanese scholar Kosugi Hanayo says that the Japanese reticence towards swearing is related to the idea of Kotodama. This phrase, which could be translated as the spirit of words, refers to the belief that utterances can have magical effects on reality. When negative things are expressed, they actually alter the world around them, bringing those bad things into existence. In a less spiritual sense, this seems to reflect the sociological idea of the power of discourse. This video you're currently watching, for example, contains that power. Once viewed, the words therein are absorbed and to some extent affect the world outside of the digital screen, however slightly. Kosugi quotes Onomichio writing about Norito, Shinto prayers. In ancient times, people believed the language had a spiritual power and its work was miraculous. This is what we call the belief in Kotodama. If someone says a benediction, happiness will come. But if they should employ curses, they will come to grief. For Kosugi, this long-held belief in the reality-bending powers of utterances is still at play in linguistic self-censorship. Kosugi also relates the idea of the power of words to what is often considered the first case of modern Kotobagari, wartime-era self-censorship. Now, if you're learning Japanese, you may have at one time wondered at why, amidst so many English loanwords to do with sports, for example, basketball, tennis, rugby, the word yaku for baseball stands alone as a Japanese created word. The term, which literally means field ball, is in fact a linguistic remnant of wartime Kotobagari. Even during World War II, baseball remained an incredibly popular sport in Japan. Yet the intrinsic relationship between baseball and wartime enemy America rankled many in the militaristic society of the day. Words like beisboru and storaiku, strike, disappeared from publication and broadcast, and in their place emerged words like yaku and seikyu, which means ball. Baseball was not the only American or Western invention to suffer this fate. Essentially all popular Western loanwords were phased out of existence between 1943 and 1945, the last years of the war. These included soccer, which in Japanese is saka, which in turn became shukyu, literally kicking ball. Fry, the loanword for deep-fried food, became yoten, literally Western tempura. An ironic name given tempura itself came from Portugal. Microphone, the thing that I'm speaking into right now, a microphone, morphed into sowaki, transmitter. These are only a few brief examples, yet of these only yaku for baseball as well as the attendant terms of the sport seem to have stuck in the long term. Perhaps this was because of the sheer popularity of baseball, which has been a sort of national sport in Japan since its arrival many decades before World War II. The replacement of Indo-European loanwords with purpose-made Japanese terms during the bellicose war years is easily explainable. Xenophobia, combined with worries of cultural influence from an enemy, resulted in local censorship. Yet the aforementioned Kosugi believes there's more to the World War II-era suppression of English words. That the power of Kotodama meant uttering the words of the enemy gave the enemy power. In Kosugi's opinion, this instinct towards guttural avoidance still plays a part in modern Kotobagari. For Japan, the end of World War II was the ultimate catastrophe. We've spoken of this many times already on the channel, but 60% of urban space lay in ruins. Infrastructure and the economy were bombed out and functionally non-existent. Society was turned upside down, as the American occupation force arrived and began a program of democratization. English self-censorship gave way to a newfound wave of westernization from both above and below. While the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers originally set out to abolish militaristic ways of thinking, the shifting nature of the Cold War quickly put the kibosh on some of the higher ideals of the occupation. America now looked to set up Japan as a military bulwark against communism, a phenomenon known as the reverse course. Despite mass popular movements aimed at making Japan a more just society, some aspects of historical criticism would have to wait. In Japan as elsewhere, the late 1960s saw an incredible surge in youth counterculture, as students and other people, aided by conscientious adults, attempted to change their society and the world. Society as a whole also grappled with new ideas brought to the forefront. We've discussed some of these ideas already in our first video about the Japanese Red Army, so if you'd like to go a little bit more in depth about the activism of the era, I recommend checking that out. During this period, activist groups began to make waves by publicly lambasting mass media for the use of discriminatory words. As news networks and publishing houses slowly reacted to criticism, the process of Kotobagari began anew. And it all started with references to Japan's darkest open secret, the burakumin undercaste. In some sectors of Buddhist thought, there is an imagined spiritual contamination brought on by closeness to death or the dead. Such conceptions have become associated with people and communities whose work revolves around death. For example, butchers, leather workers, sanitation workers, undertakers, and garbage collectors, among others. During the Edo era, from 1603 to 1867, a time of legalistic class-based segregation, the Tokugawa shogunate codified the discrimination wielded towards people who worked in these industries into a new caste, which in our current parlance we call burakumin. Society at large viewed the burakumin as impure, and the impurity to be catching. People forced into the caste who otherwise were of the exact same ethnic background as other Japanese were shunned and reviled. They lived in separate communities, often run down, impoverished, and avoided by those of other castes. In fact, the modern word burakumin literally means people of the hamlet. The Tokugawa shogunate fell in 1867 and the caste system alongside it. The centralizing and modernizing Meiji government that arose in the shogunate's place liberated the burakumin from their legalistic bondage. Yet, at the same time, they did little to help alter societal perceptions about caste-based impurity. Being of burakumin descent, or being born in their historical neighborhoods, was enough to ensure lifelong discriminatory treatment. To this day, a directory is published which lists those of buraku heritage. Some prospective employers and conservatively minded parents still look up unfamiliar newcomers or suitors to ensure they aren't contaminated by a buraku bloodline. Buraku rights activist groups took to the stage during the age of activism that existed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Chief among these was the Buraku Liberation League, or the Buraku Kaiho Dome, originally founded by buraku activist Matsumoto Jiichiro. Among its many goals was the elimination of discriminatory speech towards buraku people, such as the particularly reviled term eta, literally great amount of filth, itself the former term used for the buraku people. Even the word tosatsujo, or slaughterhouse, is considered sensitive because of its association with the vulgarity of animal slaughter and, by association, the burakumin. The BLL pressure worked. Eta and other such discriminatory words quickly became impolitic, replaced by such euphemistic terms as discriminated community, the term from which the modern term burakumin originates. However, this did little to raise awareness of the strife of the buraku people. Rather, there remains a generalized belief in Japan that speaking about discrimination simply makes more people aware that there even exists a group to be targeted at all, an idea that seems to easily map onto the magical thinking of Kotodama. By self-censoring discriminatory words, the mass media could avoid protests from buraku groups while still doing little to address their actual issues. This, on the whole, is the entire ethos of Kotobagari. Indeed, the term, which literally means word hunting, is a sardonic one. Problematic words can be hunted down while context and the deeper issues at play are ignored. Buraku issues, for example, are still very taboo and are rarely spoken of, whether in polite language or no. Critics see Kotobagari as a meaningless cycle. An activist group criticizes the use of a word, apologies are made, the word is euphemistically replaced, and then criticism over the euphemism begins. All the while, the real issue of discrimination is ignored. Kotobagari is a controversial issue. Criticism of its practice exists from both discriminated against groups, as well as from the usual sectors who simply don't like their language usage being policed. It's easy to imagine similar issues in other countries about the changing nature of language, and what society comes to understand as discriminatory. Yet, the discrimination and damage present in many of the now banned terms is self-evident. Even if self-censoring results in a never-ending euphemism treadmill, wherein discriminatory words are replaced with more scientific terms, which then themselves enter a slangy lexicon and become discriminatory in turn. In Japan, many of these words, which are subject to internal self-censorship, continue to revolve around the taboos of disease and disability. One such word is that for leprosy, otherwise known as Hansen's disease. The chronic malady, which causes painful and disfiguring lesions and nerve damage, has been the subject of much historical fear world-round. In Japan, those suffering from the disease were often segregated and placed in restrictive quarantine. Merely being related to someone with the disease was a good enough reason for social ostracization. Hansen's disease sufferers were so reviled that the prejudice spilled out beyond the home islands and into Japanese colonies. In 1942, when Japan invaded tiny Pacific Nauru, all 39 Nauruan leprosy sufferers were rounded up and placed in confinement. Later on, their families were informed that the diseased were being sent to a faraway island for better care. In reality, the military garrison placed them in a boat and, once out of sight of Nauru, murdered each and every one of them in cold blood. In modern times, leprosy remains taboo. In 2001, the Japanese government felt compelled to issue an apology and reparations to sufferers. Only years earlier, Miyazaki Hayao, the founder of Studio Ghibli, purposely portrayed the discrimination faced by those with leprosy in his film Princess Mononoke. One of the few times the disease has been depicted in mainstream Japanese media.
私も呪われた身ゆえ、あなたの怒りや悲しみはよくわかる。わかるなら、どうかその人を殺さないでおくれ。その人はわしらを人として扱ってくださったたった一人の人だ。わしらの病を恐れず、わしの腐った肉を洗い、布を巻いてくれと。おさ、生きることは誠に苦しくつらい。世を呪い、人を呪い、それでも生きたい。どうか。
Meanwhile, old words for the disease, and those who suffer from it, have been subject to Kotobagari. In particular, the word rai, leprosy, and attendant terms like raisha, leper, are considered extremely sensitive. The actual discussion of the treatment of those with Hansen's disease remains minimal, however. The next great target of Kotobagari are words related to physical disability, cognitive disability, and mental illness. Much as elsewhere, Japanese society has long considered physical and mental ailments unsightly. Stigma remains, and awareness of issues related to mental health is scant. The website Barrier Free Japan is a great English language resource for news about disability and disabled people in the country for those who are interested. Numerous once common words to describe these conditions are now taboo and very rarely appear in publication. Kichigai, the poorly chosen word used in iCarly, is one such term. Others include the word meikura for blind, oshi for deaf-mute, and tsunbo for deaf. Similar to Kichigai, there's also hakuchi, moron. Perhaps awkwardly, the title of Kurosawa's adaptation of Dostoevsky's The Idiot. These terms are all hurtful, and have been relegated to the lexical dustbin for a reason. Still, the same issue exists here as with the rest of Kotobagari. The words may be crossed off and replaced with more neutral phrases, for example, mei no fujiyu, literally impairment of the eyes for visual impairment, but much discussion remains to be done as regards the actual stigmatization of disabilities in Japanese society. Kotobagari goes beyond disabilities, however. Vocations are also subject. For example, the title of the school staff position, which was once called kozukai-san, meaning chore person, but essentially a janitor, has gone through multiple permutations. Each, in turn, is considered condescending. Multiple turns on the euphemism treadmill onwards, and we currently have gakko yomuin, school orderly, as the respectful term de jure. Examples of Kotobagari abound. Beyond what we've discussed here are several more examples of discriminatory words left over from Japan's century of colonialism. Words still used in a racially derogatory way today by the far right to denigrate Chinese, Korean, Ainu, and other minorities. Here, criticism of societal self-censorship can sometimes verge into stating the desire to be able to use historical terms that were clearly discriminatory from the get-go. Interestingly, the Japanese dub of the PlayStation 4 game Ghost of Tsushima resurrects the now offensive Moko for Mongol. While appropriate in the historical setting of the game, it now has a discriminatory association, much like the equally outdated and offensive English term Mongoloid. Kotobagari has retroactively resulted in the criticism of lyrics in a song by the famed punk band The Blue Hearts, and anger aimed at the title of a fishing manga. The former used a single utterance of Kichigai in the original recording, and Tsurukichi Sanbei, Fishing Crazy Sanbei, uses a shortened version of the same word in its title. At times, broadcast self-censorship can approach a level of near farce. On NHK channels, for example, shows focusing on learning the Korean language feel the need to refer to Korean as Hangul language, hanguru-go. This is done in order to avoid upsetting either South or North Korea, the governments of which clash over the correct Japanese term for the Korean language. Hangul, on the other hand, is the Korean script invented by King Sejong the Great in 1443, and is not a spoken language. Despite controversies, however, the sort of self-censorship represented by Kotobagari is, in fact, simply a natural element in the evolution of language. As our societies look inwards, or are forced into doing so, recognizing historical and continuing injustices, derogatory terms are necessarily dropped and stigmatized. Words, after all, have no inherent meaning. They are merely sounds, in many ways arbitrary. Whether in Japan or elsewhere, societal context is what creates significance. Words have power, whether imbued with a spirit of Kotodama or not. Word hunting is imperfect and problematic, but so is human language in of itself. For the time being, the cycle of criticism, apologies, self-censorship, and criticism of self-censorship will continue. The hunt is on, and the treadmill remains active. Alright everyone, hope that made for some intriguing and educational viewing. I'd personally known a certain amount about these words, and they're being essentially banned from broadcast beforehand, but that encounter with the word in iCarly sent me on a bit of a journey to find out more. It's really interesting just how much history is built into what words we perceive as offensive and why. On the Patreon front, here's our question for the video. Ethan asks, as a foreigner looking into living in Japan, what are the common paths to finding a professional life, as well as connecting with your local community? This is a pretty important and wide-ranging question for a lot of people interested in the country. For most Anglophone foreigners looking to start working in Japan, English teaching is the most common gateway. The JET program, for example, and which I participated in, is a famous government-sponsored position in which English speakers are placed in public schools across Japan to assist with English education and promote cross-cultural experiences. Beyond JET, there are numerous English teaching dispatch companies and conversation schools that are always on the lookout to hire those hoping to come to Japan. However, it's worth noting that many of these jobs are far from high-paying and often have hours and aspects that some find draining. Others, of course, love having these jobs, and at the very least on the JET program, I really enjoyed teaching. Other professional venues of entering Japan include translation or technical companies, IT, and the like, and Japanese corporations are often looking for employees who can increase internationalization, especially those who are at least somewhat bilingual. The question of community building is also important since living in a foreign country is no simple thing. Isolation and culture shock can and will wreak havoc on emotional well-being. It's important to find an in, either with local people, very important if really experiencing Japan and speaking Japanese is your goal, or with fellow immigrants, which can often be a somewhat easier route. Joining local clubs is a common way to meet people, as is getting involved in online groups for new arrivals. Isolation can make you feel anxious about social events, but the only way out is to put yourself out there. Although it's worth noting that a good deal of social events in Japan revolve around nomikai, that is, drinking parties, which can be a problem for people who don't really like that atmosphere or like drinking. The important thing is to keep trying in a way that you're comfortable with. Many of my favorite people in the world are those I've met in Japan, both Japanese nationals and not, and I think that there is great value in living in the country and making that experience your own. Anyway, hope this was a valuable answer, Ethan, and if anyone else wants to ask a question, join our Patreon. It's how we get pretty much all our funding, and it's what allows us to keep on putting out the content we believe in. I'll be back very soon with the second part of our Japanese Red Army series, and until then, be well, and mata ne. I actually recently consulted with popular YouTuber Quentin Reviews for a section of a video discussing the Nickelodeon